Tamika Reynolds, leave the ledges alone and step away from the workstation.
I kept these buildings running for years. After everything I handled, I took what I was owed.
Once is a mistake. Twice is suspicious. Tamika Reynolds did this to 60 tenants across years of operation and left a paper trail for every single one.
60 tenants are missing deposits, and the escrow reports tied to your desk are false.
I'm not ashamed of it. They used me, ignored me, and left me to fix every mess, so I balanced it myself.
She would not get the chance to explain. Within 48 hours, forensic accountants would pull 3 years of bank records and find the number that made the case impossible to defend. Tenant ledgers said more than $250,000 was being held safely in escrow. The actual escrow account contained less than 3,000, 60 families. Every single deposit those families had scraped together for months. Gone, redirected, spent. And Tamika Reynolds, the property manager they had trusted with their signatures and their savings, was about to find out that the spreadsheet she had built to hide the theft was the same spreadsheet that would send her to prison. Before we go any further, I want you to think about this. How much of your paycheck are you sitting on right now for a security deposit, a down payment, a rainy day fund, money you handed over to somebody because a piece of paper told you it would be safe? Drop a comment and tell me how much you have parked somewhere on trust right now. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. This channel doesn't let stories like this get buried, and there are a lot more of them than you think. Tamika Reynolds was born in 1978 in Greenville, South Carolina, the second of 3 daughters raised by Vernell Reynolds, a licensed cosmetologist who owned a small salon called Vernell's House of Beauty on West Washington Street, and Marcus Reynolds, a diesel mechanic who worked the overnight shift at a freight yard off Highway 25. The house was modest, a 3-bedroom rental on Anderson Road, and money was tight but predictable. Vernell taught her daughters early that a woman needed to understand 3 things: how to save $1, how to read a lease, and how to never sign anything she had not read twice. Tamika inherited her mother's steadiness with numbers. By the time she was 11, she was working the salon reception desk on Saturdays, booking appointments in a spiral notebook, and counting out change from a tin cash box her mother kept under the counter. She learned to reconcile the day's take against the appointment log before she was tall enough to see over the register. Vernell paid her in $10 bills and made her deposit half of every payment into a savings account at First Citizens Bank. By 14, Tamika could total a day's receipts in her head faster than the adults could do it with a calculator. She graduated from Greenville High School in 1996 with a B+ average and a letter of recommendation from her business teacher that described her as quietly ambitious and unusually careful with detail. She enrolled at Greenville Technical College that fall, working toward an associate's degree in business administration while waiting tables at a Cracker Barrel off Interstate 85. She finished the degree in 2.5 years and took her first office job at a regional insurance broker, processing renewal notices for a starting wage of $9.70 an hour. She was, by every measure her supervisors could produce, exactly the kind of employee small companies fought to hold on to. She married Andre Boykin in 2001, a truck driver she had met at church, and their daughter Kennedy was born the following spring. The marriage lasted 6 years. When it ended, Tamika kept custody, kept the apartment on Pleasantburg Drive, and started applying for anything that paid a decent hourly rate with benefits. She spent 1.5 years at a credit union, another 2 years managing the front office at a dental practice. The pattern in her resume was steadiness. She stayed. She was on time. She learned every system her employers put in front of her. The application that changed her life was for an assistant property manager position at Southridge Residential Group, a mid-sized apartment management company that operated 4 garden-style complexes across the upstate. The starting salary was $34,000, plus a 2-bedroom unit rent-free as long as she lived on site. She started in July of 2008. Her first-year evaluation described her as meticulous with paperwork, professional under pressure, and a natural fit for tenant relations. Within 3 years, she was promoted to property manager over her own complex. Within 6, she was overseeing 3 properties totaling over 400 units. By 2019, the company had given her signing authority on all tenant refunds, sole access to the escrow banking portal, and a corporate credit card for property expenses. The regional director wrote in her review that year that Tamika was the most trusted operational manager the company had in the Carolinas. That trust would prove to be the single most expensive mistake the company ever made. An apartment security deposit is, by design, not the landlord's money. Under South Carolina law, deposits collected at lease signing must be held in trust for the duration of the tenancy and returned within 30 days of move-out, minus any documented damages. The state does not require deposits to be placed in a segregated interest-bearing account. It only requires that they be available when the tenant asks for them back. That gap between what the law requires and what most tenants assume is where every embezzlement scheme in this industry begins. At Southridge Residential Group, deposits were supposed to work like this. A new tenant signed a lease and wrote a check, usually equal to 1 month's rent, ranging from $800 for a studio to $1,900 for a 3-bedroom. The property manager on site logged the deposit into the tenant management software, generated a receipt, and physically walked the check to the corporate deposit slot at the branch of South State Bank across the parking lot from the main office. From there, it moved into a pooled escrow account, controlled by corporate accounting. Monthly, the property manager was supposed to reconcile the on-site tenant ledger against the corporate escrow balance and email the reconciliation to the regional director. Any discrepancy over $100 required a written explanation and a follow-up audit. That was the theory. In practice, the reconciliation had been reduced to a formality. The regional director, a man named Doug Whitaker, oversaw 17 properties across 3 states and reviewed the monthly ledgers by scrolling through PDF attachments during long conference calls. He had never once flagged a discrepancy on any of Tamika's reports. Nobody at corporate had audited a physical bank statement against a physical tenant ledger since 2016. The tenants themselves had no visibility whatsoever. They received a paper receipt at lease signing, a lease document that mentioned an escrow account without naming it, and a promise that the money would be returned within 30 days of move-out. They did not receive statements. They could not log in and check a balance. They had no idea which bank the account was held at, or whether the account existed at all. They trusted the system. The system trusted Tamika, and nobody at any point was actually watching the money. The first diversion was small enough to be a mistake. On the morning of September 14, 2019, Tamika accepted a $900 security deposit check from a new tenant, a nursing student named Alicia Cordero, moving into a 1-bedroom at the Southridge Meadowbrook complex. Instead of walking the check across the lot to the corporate deposit slot at South State, Tamika endorsed it and deposited it into a Wells Fargo checking account she had opened 3 weeks earlier, listed under the name Reynolds Property Services, LLC. The LLC had no employees, no clients, no legitimate business. It existed on paper as a management consulting firm. It existed, in fact, as a place to park stolen deposits. She entered the deposit into the tenant management software normally. Alicia Cordero received a proper receipt. The ledger showed $900 in escrow. The corporate account showed nothing because nothing had been deposited there, and nobody noticed. That first month, she did it twice more. $2,300 redirected in September, $4,100 in October, $6,800 in November. By the end of the first year, she had diverted approximately $54,000 in tenant deposits into the Reynolds Property Services LLC account, and she had used exactly none of that money for anything resembling business expenses. The bank records that federal accountants would later reconstruct read like a household budget written in stolen money. A $400 payment to Discover Card, $260 to Capital One, $900 to the private academy where her daughter Kennedy had enrolled for 10th grade, $1,100 to a plastic surgeon's office in Charlotte, charges at Nordstrom, at Louis Vuitton, at a resort in Punta Cana, a $3,000 down payment on a used Lexus RX 350, property taxes on a small vacation cabin in the North Carolina mountains that Tamika had bought in cash the previous spring. The escalation followed the pattern of every embezzlement case federal prosecutors had ever charted. It started as one check that felt like a loan. It became a system. By 2021, Tamika had built a rotation. When an outgoing tenant requested a refund, she pulled the money from a new tenant's incoming deposit, wired it into the corporate refund account, and issued the check. The outgoing tenant got their money back within the promised 30 days. The corporate books balanced. The tenant ledger showed both deposits still safely held. The gap between the ledger and reality grew a little larger with every cycle. She was, in the language of forensic accountants, running a lapping scheme. It was a technique older than the phrase itself, a technique so common in property management embezzlement cases that federal auditors had a specific decision tree for uncovering it. It required only 3 things to work. First, a manager with sole control over both the ledger and the bank account. Second, a continuous stream of new deposits arriving faster than old ones needed to be refunded. Third, nobody looking. Tamika had all 3. Her lifestyle changed in ways that a careful supervisor would have noticed. She traded the Lexus for a new one every 18 months. She wore diamond studs to work. She took Kennedy to Aruba twice, to Cancun, and on a Disney cruise. She paid off her mother's mortgage in a single wire transfer in the spring of 2022, a gift Vernell Reynolds would later tell investigators she had believed came from a lawsuit settlement Tamika had described but never documented. She donated $800 a month to her church. She was named the Property Management Group's Regional Employee of the Year in 2020 and again in 2022. Nobody at Southridge Residential Group asked how a property manager on a $72,000 salary was living the life she was living. Nobody at corporate accounting flagged the pattern of even-numbered deposits going missing from the escrow account. Nobody, in 3 years, ran a single independent audit against her ledger. The scheme should have collapsed under its own weight in early 2023. It didn't. It collapsed because of a woman named Denise Halpern. Denise was 61 years old, a widowed elementary school teacher who had lived at the Southridge Meadowbrook property for 4 years while she saved for the down payment on a small townhouse near her daughter in Spartanburg. She moved out on March 31, 2023, and requested her $1,200 deposit be returned. The move-out inspection was clean. The lease had ended without incident. Tamika promised the check would arrive within the 30-day window. It didn't. Denise called on day 32 and was told the check was in processing. She called on day 45 and was told there had been a system issue with corporate accounting. She called on day 60 and was told the ledger could not be immediately located and someone would follow up. Nobody followed up. On day 73, Denise Halpern, who had spent 34 years teaching 6th graders how to read a contract, filed a formal written complaint with the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs. That complaint alone might have gone nowhere. Consumer Affairs receives thousands of landlord-tenant complaints a year and resolves most of them through a form letter to the landlord. What made this one different was that in the space of 6 weeks, 4 more identical complaints arrived. All 5 complainants had been tenants at Southridge Meadowbrook. All 5 had moved out between January and April of 2023. All 5 had been told their deposit records could not be located. Consumer Affairs forwarded the pattern to the state's Economic Crimes Unit at the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. A junior investigator named Sarah Bledsoe pulled the file on a Thursday afternoon in July. By Friday morning, she had contacted Southridge Residential Group's corporate counsel and requested access to the escrow account records for the past 36 months. The corporate counsel, a woman named Priya Ranganathan, made a phone call to Doug Whitaker, the regional director, and asked a simple question. When was the last time anyone had run an independent reconciliation between Tamika Reynolds' tenant ledger and the actual escrow account balance? Doug Whitaker paused for 11 seconds. Then he said he would call her back. He did not call her back. He drove directly to South State Bank, requested a printout of the escrow account balance as of that morning, and looked at a number he could not process. According to Tamika's tenant ledger, the account was supposed to be holding approximately $253,000 in active tenant deposits. The actual balance was $2,841.16. Doug Whitaker sat in his car in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes before he called corporate counsel back. When he did, the only thing he said was, "We have a problem. We are about to get into the investigation, and this is where it gets ugly. If you've stayed with me this far, do me one favor. Subscribe." This channel goes deep on the cases that mainstream true crime skips because the victims aren't famous and the numbers aren't billion-dollar. 60 Renters is not a story that ever gets prime time. It is a story that matters anyway. The investigation moved fast. Priya Ranganathan hired a forensic accounting firm out of Charlotte within 72 hours and gave them read-only access to every account, ledger, and email Tamika Reynolds had ever touched. The lead accountant, a former IRS criminal investigator named Marcus Threadgill, needed exactly 4 business days to reconstruct the scheme. Threadgill's method was the same one that solved every embezzlement case of this shape. He pulled the master tenant ledger, which showed every deposit ever collected across the 3 properties Tamika managed. He pulled the escrow account statements from South State Bank going back to 2018. He built a running comparison. For the first 4 years, the 2 numbers tracked closely, with normal reconciliation drift. Beginning in September 2019, they began to diverge, slowly at first, then dramatically. By the summer of 2023, the ledger showed $253,000 in escrow. The bank account held less than $3,000. Threadgill traced the missing funds through subpoenaed records from Wells Fargo. Every diverted deposit had flowed into the Reynolds Property Services LLC account. From there, the money had been spent, in transactions that were not remotely disguised, on personal expenses. The subpoena returned Tamika's phone records and her personal email. Investigators found a text message thread with her sister Deanna, dated April 12, 2022. Deanna asked if Tamika could help cover a car repair. Tamika replied at 9:47 that night. Deanna: "Girl, I'm sorry to ask, but this transmission is $2,100 and I don't have it." Tamika: "How much do you actually need?" "I got you." Deanna: "Are you sure? That's a lot." Tamika: "I said I got you. Company account is doing well right now. Nobody watches it that close anyway." That last sentence became Exhibit 47 at trial. They found more. A note in Tamika's personal Google Drive titled Rotation, which appeared to be a spreadsheet tracking which incoming deposits were being used to cover which outgoing refunds. A conversation with her boyfriend at the time, a man named Curtis Stallings, in which she referred to the LLC as my slush. A voicemail she had left for her accountant asking, on the record, whether the IRS could see into an LLC account that only received deposits and only wrote checks. The smoking gun, the piece that made the case impossible to defend, was the reconciliation itself. Investigators discovered that every monthly reconciliation Tamika had emailed to Doug Whitaker for nearly 4 years had been fabricated. She had built a template that pulled the tenant ledger balance from the property management software and pasted it into a field labeled bank balance, so the 2 numbers always matched. She had signed her name to 46 consecutive reconciliations, each one certifying that the escrow account contained exactly what the ledger said it contained. Not one of them was true. 60 tenants were identified as victims by the end of the investigation. The total loss, once every diverted deposit was traced, came to $271,400. The arrest was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. SLED investigators wanted to catch Tamika at the leasing office before she had time to reach a laptop or a phone. Sarah Bledsoe and 2 other agents pulled into the Southridge Meadowbrook parking lot at 9:12 a.m. on October 24, 2023. Tamika was at her desk in the front office, wearing a cream blazer and dark slacks, coffee cup at her elbow, meeting with a new tenant who was signing a lease on a 2-bedroom unit. Bledsoe waited for the tenant to leave. Then she walked to the front counter and identified herself. "Agent Bledsoe, Tamika Reynolds, I'm Special Agent Bledsoe with SLED. I need you to step out from behind the desk. Tamika, what is this about? Agent Bledsoe, it's about the escrow account. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement, misappropriation of trust funds, and fraud. I need you to stand up slowly and keep your hands where I can see them. Tamika, there has to be a mistake. I need to call corporate. I need to call Doug. Agent Bledsoe, ma'am, corporate is the one who called us. Stand up, please. Tamika stood. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the tenant lease still open on her monitor, the receipt printer still warm, the cream mug of coffee going cold on the desk. She said one more thing before an agent stepped behind her with cuffs. Tamika, I can explain the numbers. If you let me pull up the software, I can show you everything reconciles. Agent Bledsoe, we have already pulled up the software, ma'am. That is exactly why we're here. They walked her out through the leasing office lobby. Two prospective tenants sitting on the leather couches watched her leave in handcuffs. One of them was holding a checkbook. Tamika Reynolds was indicted by a Greenville County grand jury on November 8, 2023, on 12 counts of embezzlement of trust funds, 4 counts of forgery, 8 counts of obtaining property under false pretenses, and a single overarching count of breach of trust with fraudulent intent for an amount exceeding $10,000, which under South Carolina law carries a maximum sentence of 10 years per count. The total exposure, if convicted on every charge and sentenced consecutively, was theoretically over 200 years. Her defense attorney, a Greenville criminal defense specialist named Antoine Fielder, filed for a plea negotiation within 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The reconciliation spreadsheets alone were catastrophic. There was no coherent defense to a document she had signed 46 times certifying a number she had personally fabricated. The plea agreement, finalized on March 18, 2024, was straightforward. Tamika pled guilty to 1 count of breach of trust exceeding $10,000 and 8 counts of embezzlement. In exchange, the remaining charges were dropped. She agreed to full restitution in the amount of $271,400, secured against the sale of the North Carolina cabin, the Lexus, and the contents of every account associated with Reynolds Property Services, LLC. Sentencing took place on May 22, 2024, in Judge Constance Palmer's courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Greenville County Courthouse. 14 victims delivered impact statements. The one the reporters wrote about afterward came from Denise Halpern, the retired teacher whose complaint had started the entire investigation. Denise Halpern, I saved that $1,200 for 4 years. I ate ramen noodles some weeks so I could add another $20 to that envelope. I trusted you with it because you smiled at me every time I walked into the leasing office. My daughter had to lend me the deposit for my next apartment. She's a single mother. She didn't have it either. You didn't just take money from me. You took a year of my dignity. Judge Palmer's sentencing statement ran 4 pages. She addressed Tamika directly. Judge Palmer, Ms. Reynolds, this court has reviewed thousands of financial fraud cases in 22 years on the bench. Very few of them involved a defendant who occupied a position of trust as clearly and abused it as deliberately as you did. The people you stole from were not corporations. They were nursing students. They were retirees. They were single mothers. Every dollar you took was a dollar they had counted twice before handing to you. You built a system designed to hide your theft from the exact people who had the least power to catch you. You signed your name 46 times to a lie. That is not desperation. That is calculation. The sentence was 72 months in the South Carolina Department of Corrections, followed by 5 years of probation and full restitution. Tamika was assigned to the Camille Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia, a medium-security women's facility. Her earliest projected release date is 2029. She will be 52 years old. Alicia Cordero, the nursing student whose deposit was the first ever diverted, never got her $900 back from Tamika directly. She got it back 4 years later, in a restitution check from the state, on stationery that misspelled her last name. She cashed it and used it as the deposit on a new apartment. The property manager who took her check that day walked it across the lot to the bank herself. That case was hard to sit with. But the one on the right-hand side is worse. 60 victims is a lot. What this next manager did to 130 people is on another level entirely. Click it now.